Hi, I'm Ashley with Campbell. Thanks for investing your time to help your community be a great place to live. Before you watch the video, make sure to click the subscribe button so that we can help you make educated decisions as a board member.
What we're going to do in this presentation is that we're going to make you aware of the kind of paints that we have available, of the paints that are available, and how to be able to do that. So again, knowledge is going to be your best defense. So it's a good idea how to hopefully be able to impart some of that knowledge to you. A little bit of background on myself. I am been with Benjamin Moore for 32 years here in the South Florida market. I've been working in the paint business in South Florida since I was 16. So I've been at it for at least a couple of years, and again, all in the South Florida market. So I know the area very, very well. A lot of you know me, and we've done quite a few projects. One unique thing about Benjamin Moore that I throw in there is that we don't work with, we don't have company-owned stores. Every store that you see Benjamin Moore being sold out of are local owners, like the Campbell property manager. There's not a national chain of Benjamin Moore. So again, you get the personalized service, and I think over the last year since we've been in business since 1883, we've done it. It has really helped us, kind of make sure that we're getting their best service and the best products out there. So as we go along, please use the Q&A button to answer any questions. We'll try to answer questions as we go along. If not, if it takes too much of a segue, then I'll be more than happy to answer any questions for you afterwards. Okay. So this is my information that we're going to be having for this particular course. The course should end at about 6 o'clock tonight. So no, I'm just joking. We'll be done by about 1 o'clock, so we could get you out of here and get back to your day. But again, my thanks to both Dan and Ashley for inviting me on here and for you guys listening to me. So again, hopefully we can do something for you here and help you out. Okay, the learning objectives, we're going to kind of provide an overview of the classifications of the paints, some of the advantages and disadvantages of using the products itself versus oil and latex, surface prep and priming and so forth. We're going to classify paints by the resin types and the curing mechanism. In South Florida, I can't tell you how important that is to know, to pick that, and how things like dew point affect that process of curing. I want you to know some of the physical properties of latex paint and oil-based paint, and some of the advantages and disadvantages. Talk a little bit about preparation. We're going to get a little bit into that. We're going to talk about color and why people paint and so forth. And then one of the best things we like to do is that I like to be able to talk about paint problems, because if we know what causes a problem as we're looking at a job, or even if you're doing a particular job, whatever size job you're doing, from your own place to doing an entire community or entire building, you're able to avoid these issues and know what kind of products that you're going to be able to fit into it. So here we go. All right. There's different types of paints that are classified. The different types of paints are classified according to the type of resin they contain. For instance, latex is a latex resin. Alkyd are generally alkyd resins, and so on. And they're also kind of separated by the way that, and this is really key for our market, is how they dry and cure. So you have to be really aware of that. The paints that we're going to run into the most are going to be the latex paints, acrylic paints, and the oil-based paints. Those are going to be the most common types used. And quite frankly, nowadays with the EPA regulations and our environment, actually there's very little oil-based paint now being used, especially outside on the different surfaces of your properties. And then having that knowledge is going to help, like I mentioned before, it's going to help you. If you have the knowledge of the resin and what you're going to be able to do, it's going to help you kind of avoid any kind of issues and know what's going to be the best product, because it's not just a matter of putting the paint on the surface. You really got to know how the environment is going to affect you, and how those products are going to dry, so that you can get to that performance that you're going to need on the products itself. So, all right, classifying paints. Again, what we mentioned before, like I mentioned before, paints can be classified according to the type of resin or the curing mechanism. The resin basically is the glue that holds the pigment or the color in suspension and gives that coating its particular performance characteristics. So paint is made up of 3 different pieces. You're going to have the pigment, which gives it the color. the resin, which is the glue. But if you just use those two, the material will be so pasty you wouldn't be able to apply it. So you have to add a solvent to that, and that will allow the product to be liquid enough to be able to apply it to the substrate you want to paint. And what determines the solvent is going to be the kind of resin it is. So again, that's going to be a real big piece of our conversation. And then the curing mechanism we're going to talk about determines what the drying time is. And you can imagine in our, look what's happened in the last couple of weeks, where it just the humidity level has just absolutely cranked up. The other day it was up to 80 something in the 80s percentage. So it just, all that kind of stuff affects the way that coatings dry and how they cure. So it's something that you really have to keep in mind when you're picking coatings for the area. And again, most of this, a lot of this is a lot of information. I'll be more than happy to help you kind of work yourself through that. It's like trying to try to fix a plumbing problem in your house. If I tried to do that, I'd have leaks coming out everywhere. So I would hire the professional for that. So, but again, that's where we run into the different type of resin types. These are going to be some of the basics that you run into. You're not going to run into a lot of issues with these here, but you're going to have the most popular, again, as I mentioned, is going to be some latex and acrylics. And these are the, latex paint is, if you look at the latex gloves that you wear that are being worn, those rubber gloves, that really in a simple form is what the paint is. It's a plastic, and it's a form, and then we apply it in liquid matter to be able to adhere and to do what we want it to do. But that's essentially what the product does. Oils and alkyds are also going to be again a real popular type of product that's being used. We use that mainly now in interior surfaces, not just in exterior surfaces. And of course, for different circumstances, and we'll touch on that, we're going to talk a little bit about epoxies and urethanes and some of the advantages and disadvantages of using each of those resins. But before we talk about it, we have to be able to understand the curing mechanism, because if we understand the curing mechanism, especially in our climate, then it's going to be able to help us to determine what's going to be the best surface, the best product to use on your substrate, and to that it's going to do the job that we as a manufacturer would expect it to do. So all the coatings we're going to talk about today, and the majority of the coatings we talk about, they all have a solvent, as I was mentioned before, and solvent evaporation is a real important, is going to be the way that majority of coatings part of the process of how they dry. So as I mentioned, the solvents are determined by the resin and by the fact that what will actually help dissolve the resin itself. And again, we're going to be talking both about drying and curing, but the solvent evaporation is part about the drying part about it. Coalescence, this is generally with latex paint. After solvent evaporation or during the solvent evaporation process, the particles of the pigment and binder, which is we use that term for resins as well. They fuse together. They kind of we say with great force. But what that does, it helps cause that coating to kind of film and build a continuous film on the surface. And if you ever got any paint on when you've done some painting projects, if you got some on your arm or on your skin, and you kind of feel it tighten up, that's what the latex paint is doing. It's coalescing, it's tightening up, it's forming that film, and it kind of brings itself together and kind of tightens to finish up itself. With oil-based paints, they dry by oxidation, and essentially what happens is as the solvent evaporates from the oil-based paints, leaving that binder and pigment on the surface, the binder or that resin continues to dry. As it oxidizes, it reacts with the oxygen in the air. So one of the things that you'll see with oil-based paints is that they usually take a little bit longer to dry, not necessarily cure, but we'll cover that. But you'll find that an oil-based paint that's, say, a year old compared to an oil-based paint that's going to be 20 years old, there's going to be a significant difference in the hardness of that coating, because the curing process for oil-based paints really never stops. So you could actually take, that's why you could take an oil-based paint that's a year old and it'll actually have a little bit of bend to it. But if you take an old oil-based paint, you could actually snap the coating because that's how much brittle it's become. And it's important to know that because as you're trying to recoat these surfaces with an old oil-based paints, that oil-based paint is going to take a little bit more preparation to get through the hardness of how that coating gets. So something that we have to kind of keep in consideration when you're using, again, recommending products for what you're using on them. So as I discussed before, when we're talking about the curing mechanisms, we need to understand the difference between what drying is, which occurs first, and then what is curing, all right, which occurs after a period of time. There's a big difference between the both. The drying, again, occurs when that solvent has evaporated from the coating. The curing occurs when the coating has reached its optimum hardness and resistance. With oil-based paints, they do cure to a point, and then once it reaches a certain point, it will take quite a bit of time. But as I mentioned, it will never stop curing. It will become harder and harder, which is not a good thing either, because if you need a little bit of flexibility in the coating, then that could be a problem. Oil-based paints typically dry to 4 to 8 hours and cure generally within 10 days. You would think that's a little bit, it would be a little bit less, but again, with the way that it absorbs oxygen to cure, that's why it tends to do it within a shorter period of time. Latex paints tend to dry in 2 to 4 hours. Some are designed to dry even faster than that, so you have to kind of work with that. However, they take up to 30 days to cure. That coalescing process I was telling you about, where the coating kind of just becomes that surface, that's a process that 30 days, and in our environment and in our climate, sometimes it takes even longer than that. Even on the inside with air conditioning, the air seas is supposed to take the humidity out of the air, but there's still so much in there that it could take up to 90 days to 120 days to cure, to reach its optimum hardness. That's why if you read the labels of the coatings, it says don't wash the coatings or put tape on a freshly applied coating, because that coating still hasn't reached its hardness, and the adhesion of that tape could actually pull it off, or the cleaning could damage some of the coating itself. When you go to exterior now, that's where it really starts to kind of, especially during the summertime. Again, when you're painting outside on a building with a latex paint, generally the paints are designed that within an hour you can get a rainstorm on there and it won't wash anything off. However, for that coating to reach its optimum hardness, it can take sometimes 3, 4, 5 months, depending on the level of humidity. Obviously, during the summer when the humidity is so high, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, why it does that. We're going to be able to, the summer months is really going to delay some of this process of the curing of latex paint. So again, factors that affect the curing process of paint, when you're working with either latex or oil, is going to be the temperature, air movement, the humidity, the relative humidity, and dew point. Real important part that we talk about that. But not all these 4 factors together will actually influence which paint you're going to choose and what you want to try to do, along with what you're trying to achieve. Because the first thing I do when I get out to a project and you're talking to me about what you want, I always try to ask questions in regards to what is it that you're expecting, and what kind of what do you want? And that helps me, along with all these other factors, kind of piece together a puzzle to get you the right coating. For instance, we have over 4,000 different SKUs or different products in our product line. And so we have to kind of mix and match what's going to be the right system for your particular project that you're painting. So there is not one paint that's made that we could be applied to any kind of substrate. I wish there was. It would make things a lot easier for me and a lot simpler for you and the painting contractor. But unfortunately, it's not that that easy. And what you will find that a lot of the technology that we've used and we've come up with in the last few years really, has really kind of helped kind of narrow down the coatings. When I first started the paint business, we probably had close to about 8 to 10,000 SKUs in our line. So we've been able to kind of narrow that down a little bit to make it a little bit more effective. So let's talk a little bit about what affects each of the factors affecting the curing. Temperatures. Some of the aspects you want to look with temperature. Oil-based paints, when using oil-based paints, high temperatures lower their viscosity, makes it a little bit. And when we talk about viscosity, we talk about how thin or how thick the product is. So a lower viscosity means the product will be a little bit thinner. It'll run out, so it'll do that. Low temperatures, as it gets colder, will increase the viscosity of oil-based paints. With latex, if you have a lot of high temperature, it could actually affect the bonding of the resin to the substrate, and the low temperatures tend to inhibit coalescence. Thankfully, with the coatings that we have that we're using in South Florida now, you're not going to have any problems with the temperatures. It doesn't get hot enough in South Florida that you're going to run into that kind of issue. But these are some of the things that you can run into. For instance, I had a metal roof that I was painting with a latex coating, and the temperature of the roof became so high that, and this is where this happens, where we actually put the coating was applied to this metal roof when the temperature was so high, it actually what we call flash dried. And what happened is that as soon as the coating touched that hot metal roof, the solvent evaporated immediately. It did not allow the coating to be able to begin that coalescence process. So essentially what we had is that we had a coating where the solvent flash dried, it burned off, and you had a piece of sandpaper on the metal roof itself, and it was quite a big issue and quite a big problem. One of the other things that we were talking about is dealing with air movement. Oil-based paints, with oil-based paints, the air movement will shorten the dry time and remove the odors more quickly. With latex, too much air movement when it's real windy may result in flash drying of the surface itself, and you can't allow the paint to it'll cause it to crater. In other words, where you need a certain amount of time for the paint to be what we call in the industry open, so that as it's drying, the brush marks and the roller marks of how it's applied kind of tends to flow out a little bit and smooth out. And if there's too much air with latex paints, it could do that. It could cause those cratering or leave the brush marks and roller marks much more.
Hey, Rudy, we had a few questions that people
Sure,
brought up.
no problem.
One of them is, can an oil-based paint be painted over with latex?
No. Again, you could put a latex paint on an oil-based primer because it's designed to be able to receive paint on top of it. But an oil-based enamel, generally, it becomes too hard. So you either have to really prepare that surface very, very well, or the best way to do it is to put an oil-based primer first and then put the latex paint on top of that.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then someone else asked, can you please explain what a substrate is? You mentioned the word substrate.
I'm sorry. All right, not a problem. Again, I apologize about that. Substrate is the surface that you're painting on for, either it's going to be wood or it's going to be metal or concrete or masonry. That's when I refer to substrate, that's what I'm referring to. Sorry about that.
No, that's great. And then there were a couple questions early on about an area that I seem to see there's more problems than any other in our business, which is painting of outdoor concrete walkways.
Yeah.
And these going sideways. Is that something you're going to address specifically later on, or do you want to comment on that now?
No. Yeah. Again, following the CEU, we're just I have kind of a format to follow. So, but that's why I like to make this very informal and just talk about the questions that happen up. On walkways itself, it's again, we're talking about the curing and the drying mechanisms of paint. So we're very limited on what we can use because a lot of those walkways need to have return to service so quickly. But if you go with an oil-based coating, it's going to take a lot longer to dry, so it'll keep that area out of service. But then when you're using a latex paint, which is going to be, or a latex concrete stain, what ends up happening is that they're not quite as hard. So it's a combination of both. And those surfaces are really difficult surfaces that you could see in your buildings and areas that are painted with walkways. It's very difficult to maintain. The one thing when you do use a kind of a floor paints, and we sell them, and we sell quite a bit of them, is that it becomes, it's the turnover factor is quite, it's going to be a lot more than, for instance, if you paint on a wall, you're going to have to take a little bit more of a turnover time for that. Floor paints are not warranted by anyone because of that factor. And it's, again, once when I go out to a project and if I see a surface that's not a floor paint or a concrete sidewalk or anything that's not painted, I generally tell them, says, don't paint. Because once you do paint, you start wanting to, it's going to become a maintenance item, and you're going to have to kind of continue to redo that pretty much every 6 months to a year to keep it maintaining right.
Great, thank you very much. And then one other person mentioned, how long does it take to get a rendering of colors for a building?
Good question. Thank you. That's part of the process that we also do. Once we get the rendering with the service that I use, again, no charge for it, but it takes anywhere from 5 to 10 days to get the rendering back, and it really depends on how busy that the service is at the time. I've gotten it back as quickly as back in a couple days, but I've had it go as long as 2 weeks.
All right, then one last one that just popped up here. Do you recommend a pigmented concrete sealer for catwalks?
You cannot use the concrete sealer that is used on the walls on a sidewalk, because that particular product is not made to be under ponding water, and on sidewalks you do have a lot of that. So there are some particular type of primers that are made. It's going to be completely different. The best ones to use, quite honestly, are the clears. But again, that's or the stuff that most primers are not going to cover like paint. So you want to use something along that line. That the clears tend to the clear primers that are made for floors will usually be the best kind to use on it.
Okay, great. One last person asked, what would be the fee for a paint estimation?
Call me. There generally isn't a fee if you're going to be doing a paint project. And again, if you're considering painting your building or community, it's a good idea to try to schedule it. And when you know you're going to do it, whether it's a year or two out, let us know and start getting that information together from a year or two out. Most contractors, the ones who want your business, will not charge a fee for painting, for putting an estimate. If I were to go out to the community to write a specification, we don't charge for putting a paint spec together.
Great, thanks.
Okay, all right, good questions. Thank you very much for doing that. Okay, all right, and then we'll continue along using the kind of the course that I have here, but keep asking questions, and then hopefully at the end we'll have enough time to have some more questions and answers, and we'll ask more as we go along. Okay. Okay. All right. Some of the factors that affect curing as well. The biggest point that I want to talk about here is that high humidity. Again, if you have a lot of high humidity, and that's on our area, it's going to lower the appearance of oil-based paints. Lower the appearance of the gloss if you have a lot of high humidity, because it takes so long to dry, and they can possibly shift color. So that's why a lot of the oil-based paints are not being used today. And then, of course, high humidity is going to slow down the drying of latex paints. Again, humidity is the amount of water that's in the air at the time. And if solvent has to evaporate for the coating to dry, a high humidity time, there's not enough space in the air for that solvent to evaporate too. So that's why some things during the summer, it takes a little bit longer for things to dry and to cure. The other point I wanted to talk about that's very important down in South Florida is dew point. And what is dew point? And I pulled a definition from Wikipedia to help you understand that, is that the dew point is the temperature to which air must be cooled to become saturated with water. It happens as you go up, you see the clouds. That's essentially that's what's happening. When cooled further, that airborne water vapor will condense to form liquid water or dew. For instance, when you have, when we have the times of the year in the morning when your car is covered with water, that's where the dew point has reached. The air temperature has reached the point where the water and that is affected, and that dew point varies per the time of the year according to the pressure and the humidity. So it's kind of a moving target. But when you have that water form on there, that's when you know that the dew point has reached saturation. And then when the air cools to its dew point, then with contact with the surface that is colder than the air, water will condense on the surface. In other words, get a glass of water, pour some ice into it, and you have the water forming in the side of it. What's happened is that the temperature on that substrate, the glass itself, is cooler than the air, and the water condenses on the surface. And that's a real big thing you have to be careful about, because you don't want to paint either with latex paint or oil-based paint when you have that condensation or that dew on the wall itself. Fortunately, when we have dew in the mornings down here, it's usually not that big of a deal. Generally by 8, 9 o'clock, all that stuff dries off, especially when the sun hits it. But you don't want to do that because it will affect the way that the products adhere. It will cure, and it's a real important factor. And again, you know, one of the things I like to talk about, you know, when I'm going through all this information, is that painters should know this information better than I do as a manufacturer, because they're the mechanics putting it on. So, you know, make sure that your contractor understands these issues so that we don't have no kind of problems on them. All right. After knowing what's the right kind of paint to put on, the most important part of painting by far is knowing how to prepare surfaces. It's again, I'd rather have a cheap paint being used with great surface prep than a real expensive paint used with poor surface prep. So again, paints adhere to the first thing it touches. It doesn't have a personality or an attitude. It's a chemical. So that prep is really important. And what I like to do on here is we're going to run through real quick some of the basic preps, because we're running a little bit long. So I want to make sure that we cover this and just some of the basic prep standards that you're going to run into when you go on different type of surfaces. For instance, when you're painting wood, the surface has got to be, you know, it's got to be clean and dry. That's generally with everything. You got to remove the mildew. What you're seeing on there, and mildew is a big issue that we have in South Florida. You can see the guy pressure cleaning. That removes the mildew, but it's not going to clean mildew. So when you're doing that, you have to kind of sanitize the surface or kill the mildew. Generally, bleach has always been the most popular way to do it. Bleach does tend to kill not only mildew, which is a plant, it's also the state flower of Florida, as I call it, but it can kill some of the, you know, grass and plants around there. So there are some new biodegradable solutions that will work, not quite as effectively, but enough to where it won't at least harm the plants or anything like that. So those are the kind of the things that you have to do and to know about the different type of surfaces. When you're staining wood, again, it's got to be clean and dry. If you're dealing with, when you're painting or staining pressure treated wood, you've got to let that wood weather, because pressure treating is designed to keep water out of the wood, and it will keep paint from adhering properly to the wood itself, especially if you're using a latex paint and even if you're using an oil-based paint. So the only way to get around that is going to be to let that pressure treated lumber cure or to dry out, because it will over time lose that effectiveness. And it varies, you know, again, depending on how long it's going to take. I've seen it take up to 120 to 150 days. A lot of factors get into it. Best way to test, though, is to take a spray bottle and just mist a little bit of water on the wood itself. And if that water beads and runs down, that wood is not ready to paint. But if the water sits on the surface and soaks in, then you're ready to go ahead and paint on there. Restaining wood, again, we don't do a lot of this down here, but when you're restaining wood, you can't put stain on wood that already has a finish. You have to take it down to the bare substrate, and that usually involves a lot of prep and so forth like that. Painting masonry. Now, that's a surface that we don't see a lot down here. The biggest thing about painting masonry itself down here, again, most of the time we don't paint on top of new masonry. Most of the surfaces that I get involved with are usually repainted, but moisture is the killer with water is the killer with masonry. Concrete, masonry, stucco, they all have a certain amount of alkalinity or alkalines in the surface itself. That's just inherently natural with this particular surface. If you're introducing water back into that surface, and if you're painting on top of a new concrete surface, what happens is that those alkaline or the alkalines in the concrete itself solubilizes with water getting in. And what does that mean? The alkalines are generally just salts. The water that gets into the surface, it solubilizes that salts, and then but what happens is that the surface will want to dry, but as the water is evaporating, it will bring that salts to the surface, and and then once the water evaporates, it's going to deposit those salts either behind their coating, or you can see, like, for instance, if you've seen white streaks where there's a crack coming out, all that is the alkali or those salts that are being absorbed in. So you really got to make sure that you're testing that concrete for how hot, or the measurement and the amount of alkalinity in there before you paint. Because if it's too hot or too much alkaline in the surface, you either got to paint, you got to wait for it to cure out the concrete or the masonry, or you got to use a product that's going to work for it. And then that kind of narrows your options as well. Painting metal, again, when you're painting galvanized or steel metal, you usually are going to be using latex paint and waterborne paints, because if you use an oil-based paint, you can use an issue called saponification, where the alkyd resins will react with the metal itself, and it can cause the paint to lift, like what you're seeing in that particular picture here. And again, a lot of the new metal surfaces, they come in with a kind of a manufacturing glaze or oil on there. It's kind of the process. All that has got to be removed when you're painting metal, or it will affect the adhesion of the coating. Latex, metal, your epoxies, or urethane, either one, it'll be the same. So to talk about, those are some of the real kind of topics that, some of the more common areas to paint. Again, if you have anything besides that or anything specific, feel free to reach out to me at any time. So why do people paint? Most of the time, if you're painting, the color is going to help you set the mood. A lot of times color is used for safety. It helps the building look great, and it's going to help you to kind of make your building or your home either more valuable or more modern looking. It makes everybody feel good about it. The sheen, it's going to, you have one other factor when you're wanting to paint is going to affect that. But the number one reason why you want to paint, especially outside and inside, and I've always say that, is protection. All the building materials that are being used both inside and outside are being manufactured to be coated. And if you don't coat those particular surfaces, whether concrete or steel, those surfaces will not last as long without the protection that paint brings to it. So, and again, even on interior, because could you imagine painting on a drywall that has or for instance, trying to clean a drywall that's brand new that has no paint on it? What's going to happen? So those are the things that you really have to kind of take in consideration. But the number one reason that I like to paint, or I would recommend to paint, is protection. Especially if you're doing, we have a lot of the older buildings that are getting into the 30-40 year range, and that's very common now in our area, and in fact in the entire South Florida market. And water, we talked about water getting into concrete before. A lot of these buildings and homes are built with steel reinforcements within that concrete, within that masonry. If water is getting into that building, then what's going to end up happening is that you're going to be having that metal expanding, and then that metal expanding by the rusting that the metal is going to get will cause that concrete to crack and to break, and it can cause some serious structural problems. So a good maintenance program, if you're painting your buildings outside, don't go too long. You want to be able to do as much as possible to keep the water out of your building. And to be honest with you, most of the time water gets into the building through through other areas than the paint itself, through windows, roofs, and doors, and other openings. But if you wait too long to paint, then that coating will break down. You don't want that water coming through the paint itself. So you want to be able to do that. So The next thing I want to talk about real quick is color. Color again is, it's kind of affects the space and the mood of people. Color psychology, the using the right color is a real, it kind of invokes emotional responses, believe it or not. We have designers that take these kind of classes for years and, to get the degrees that they have, because color, there's so many aspects about color. And then understanding color is real critical. But one thing I do want to mention here, if you're going to be painting outside, all colors will fade outside regardless. Some colors tend to fade faster than others, depending on the pigment. The darker the color that you go with, the more of a change you're going to see in the color itself, the lighter color that you less. Picking these colors is a real important piece for painting, but at the same time, work with your manufacturing rep, not the painter, because most of them don't understand, to be honest, really don't care, to make sure that you're going to pick the colors that are what we call light fast. In other words, well, they'll fade less than other colors. For instance, a real bright yellow, they're made with synthetic pigments, that's going to fade very fast, where a yellow that has a little bit more of a muted tone or made out of like a more natural pigments will tend to last a little bit longer. So that's why it's important to be able to do that and to use that. And again, fading is, one of the things I'd like to talk about at this point is fading is not covered by warranties. And all warranties talk about the fact excessive fading, but there's really no mechanism that's covered by warranty. Excessive fading is covered by warranties, but there's no mechanism to fade how much to measure how much a color has faded. So that's why it's real important that you pick the colors that are going to fade the least amount in the area that we're in. And now, when you're looking at the color wheel, I'm going to go back and forth a little bit on here. When you're picking colors, there's really just these are some of the more common. I'm going to do a real fast approach to this. There's color schemes on how colors are put together when you're painting a building or painting your home inside or outside. Three of the most common aspects of picking color schemes are what we call the analogous colors, or basically what you're doing is choosing three colors on that color wheel. And when you're seeing this color wheel, those are a good friend, Sir Isaac Newton, kind of looked at the white light that we see, that we look at every day, contains every one of those colors in white light itself. So that's why we see color so that's why we're able to see color so vividly. So, but each of those colors have white light has all those portions of the color. But analogous color selection, for instance, if you see the one that we showed on this one, the first one, you can see the blue, the green, and the light green. That's the analogous way. Monochromatic is basically you're taking one of those colors and using different shades of it. And the one thing that if you could take away from looking with colors, that's the color wheel. That's just the way nature is made. The color is made. Those are the only colors that we have available. But what you need to do is that we're seeing a horizontal look at the color. But what you need to do is when you're picking these colors is understand that you have to kind of imagine the color of the wheel on a horizontal plane like this. But however, then you have to look at all the versions up and down above the color, up being darker colors and below being lighter colors. And putting those colors together is essentially how designers work to be able to get color schemes and to know which color kind of works with you. So I know it's kind of hard to grasp in a real quick conversation with it, but essentially that's what the color schemes are. And then the triad color schemes are real popular. And again, you usually see these are a little bit more emotional. They're made to catch attention. You'll find that a lot of the sport teams that you follow have these, or a lot of the advertising that you see use this triad color schemes because they grab more attention. They're more attention grabbing, and you can look at it. But if you think about it, you'll see that they tend to be a little bit more stimulating and eye catching. The other part I want to talk about is sheen level. There's an infinite variety of sheen levels made. There's not a standard that's being followed by all manufacturers. So the eggshell finish in Benjamin Moore might be different than the eggshell finish in Sherwin-Williams or a Behr. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. But essentially, when you're looking at sheens, that the duller that the finish is, or the less shine that you see on the surface, the more of a you're going to see less issues on the wall. The higher the surface, the more durability you're going to get on them. So we're going to talk a little bit about that here. For instance, appearance. If your appearance is, if you're selected, how do you pick which particular finish you want? If appearance is more important for you, understand these are some of the issues that you're going to run into. Higher sheens will accentuate surface defects, textures, and imperfections. Flat surfaces will hide that a little bit better, or the lower the sheen will. And then flat is going to be the most forgiving sheen. And a lot of people call flat more of an elegant finish. And again, it gives it more of a smooth finish to it. A lot of the drywalls, that are being made now, you could actually see a lot of waves and so forth when you're using a higher finish, but the flat will tend to flatten that out. But if your primary concern is durability, then understand that, the higher sheens are going to be more durable. And this is where you're starting to get into what coatings that you want. Some of the questions that I have to ask is what is it that you're looking for? What's the most important piece? The higher the sheen are more durable. They have a higher resin content. Lower sheens are not as durable, but they tend to be clean. They clean a little bit easier. Flats don't clean very well at all. And glossy finishes, they have a nice finish to it. And they're harder, so they're generally used on trim, doors, and finishes, and so forth. We talked about protection, residential protection. Again, I cannot emphasize enough on what painting is all about, and protection is really the most important part. When you're looking at commercial protection, again, you're talking about what substrates are you going to be painting, and what is it that what you're trying to look there. Commercial coatings are generally made for more of a specific area, specific reasons for what you're trying to do, how fast you want to get in there. The curing time, the drying time really affects that. There are some 2-component coatings that are used. We generally don't try to use them in the situations that you're going to be using on your properties, but sometimes they are necessary. For instance, if you want an exterior durable metal roof paint, the most durable kinds are going to be the 2-component coatings and something called an aliphatic urethane. But again, we'll help you guide along that. And then, of course, there's specialty protections, but issues like spray and if VOC or the volatile organic compounds, the odor paint is really important. It's a real important piece to try to understand, and we have to understand that so we can recommend the type of coating on there. Durability is a factor of what you're trying to look at, and splatter resistance. There are kind of coatings that are made for that. You have to be careful with it. And then and this particular slide, we're talking about coating systems. On this, I really want to talk about specifications, because one of the things, if you're going to be painting the outside of your building, is that we need to build a coating system or a specification. And the specification is not only going to tell you what the coating system, what paints to use on each substrate. However, it's going to get into the factors that you're going to run into in preparation standards and the factors that you could run into a job. So it's really important that, that whenever you're going to do a project of any kind, that you understand, even a small painting your room, understand what coating system you're going to use and all the factors we talked about to make sure that you're using the right coatings, what prep is going to do, because you don't want to, the last thing you want to do is waste money on painting a building or doing a project, even if you're one room in your house, and not have the right coatings, not do the right prep, because all that, our time is valuable. And even for a painter, that's where the most amount of, on any particular job, the paint that's being used is about 20% of the job. 80% of the job is going to be in labor and profit. So you want to make sure of that. And the other thing here, when you do have a specification, it gives you the ability to compare apples to apples. Dan was mentioning that at the first about picking a manufacturer, and use that manufacturer's instructions throughout the painting contract when choosing a painting contractors, because those contractors, if you don't have that and you ask 5 different painting contractors, you're going to have 5 different systems and 5 different methods how to do things. And then you're not going to, all it's going to do is cause more confusion and more effort than anything else. And then the most important part that I always like to talk about is, if you're going to hire a contractor to do a big project of painting the outside of your buildings or homes, inspection. Just simply because a contractor says that they have it under contract, they're going to follow that. The reality is, do you really think that a lot of these contractors in any industry, not only in the painting industry, actually follow what they're going to say. And in painting, this is real important to make sure that you're following and going through and making sure you do that. That's one of the places where I probably spend most of my time in, and those are my colleagues, because we want to make sure that that system is being followed, the preparation is being done correctly, so that you're going to have the longest amount of time. So we're getting near the close of the presentation. We only got about another 3 hours to go. Essentially, in these parts here, I'm just going to quickly go over a couple issues here. But the reason behind this is that if we know what causes a problem when you're dealing in the paint business, and painters should know this especially, because a lot of times, we'll do an inspection, but we can't see everything. So painters need to know this as well. But knowing what the problems, how problems occur or why, and when we see a problem, it helps us, first of all, to select the right paint, to select the kind of preparation that's needed, and then select the right contractor. Most of the time, when I have a paint problem, and I'm not saying this because I'm a manufacturer, about 90 to 95%, let's be more realistic. Most of the time, failures in coatings are made by either the substrate, wrong coating on the wrong substrate, or preparation or application by the contractor or the person who's applying it. Paint is very simple to make. We do make paint once in a while bad, but most of the time we don't, or we'd be out of business. So these are the factors you have to kind of be aware of and look at. Blocking is essentially when you get two pieces of paint, when you paint a door, especially inside, and they kind of tend to stick. Usually happens with latex paint. Some of the things you have to be kind of aware of. The better quality latex paints do a little bit better job with it. The cheaper latexes don't. So you have to kind of keep that on there. Yellowing is a problem that all oil-based paints are going to run into. You don't see it with darker colors, but you do see it with lights and oil-based paints, with whites and light off whites. Every oil-based paint will yellow, even those that say they're non-yellowing. They will yellow. You're using alkyd resins from natural resources like sunflower seed oil and other oils. They all tend to amber into yellow. So if you're painting white walls with latex paint, which will not yellow, and use an oil-based paint on the doors, and there's factors why you still want to use oil-based paint, you will have white walls in the future, and you will have a nice off-white wall, a door, and trim. So you have to be kind of careful in using that. Lapping is essentially when you're putting paint on the wall, you see kind of like the areas where you can see the roller mark on there. That's generally caused by either an unprimed surface, or that's caused by the painter not putting enough paint on there, and trying to roll too much. And because the biggest part of applying paint by roller is not the actual rolling, it's the actually taking and dipping and putting back up and making sure the paint is wet. And painters like to use as least paint as possible when they're painting on there. Hat banding is caused real quick by and this is one of my pet peeves, all jobs when it's painted, they should be cut in first and then rolled into afterwards. If not, you could see these kind of what we call hat banding out of the same bucket, where you could see these kind of issues occurring like this. So these are some of the things that we have on there. Dan, you have a question?
Yeah, so someone asked, could you please restate what you said? 90 to 95% of the failures are caused by?
Yep, 90 to 95% of the failures are caused by the substrate. You pick the wrong paint, they'll go on the wrong on that particular surface. So that's why it's real important that and again, I've got close to 45 years of experience in this market, and I'm not saying it to say, because we make sure it's caused by the substrate, using the wrong paint on the wrong substrate, or preparation. They didn't prepare right, or they didn't apply it correctly, because all paint has to be applied at a certain thickness in a certain way. The curing and and everything we talked about earlier, that will affect how a coating will work. So you have to kind of, again, these are all factors that become very important to paint.
Rudy, I think that's a huge point, because I know just in our experience, the issues we end up with it on painting projects are always people using the wrong product for the wrong kind of application, or they're just prepping it wrong, or just not getting the expertise, particularly when it's something not completely normal, like they're trying to paint some mailboxes, or they're trying to paint concrete walkways, or anything out of the ordinary at all. This is when it's super important or even ordinary, just because new products and processes and preparations are available all the time. It's just so important to go to the expert, go to your paint manufacturer.
Yeah, you have to, because there's so many ways. And again, contractors, again, like I was saying, there's a lot of good ones out there, but it doesn't, but then there's a lot of good ones that sometimes just don't understand. So you got to make sure that, they're putting the right paint in the right place to get you that job, because you don't want to waste your money on any of this, because it's silly for you, it's silly for me. It makes us all look bad. So we always like, that's why I have walked away from jobs where I can't get the right coating to use or the right prep to be done, because I don't want to just sell a can of paint and have a problem with it later on. After being this many years in the business, my reputation and the reputation of our company and who we work with is very, very important to us to get the repeat business, which is critical for us, as it is in your industry.
Right. So one other quick question someone asked is there kind of a typical range of warranties that you would expect for like an outdoor paint project?
Yeah, good question. Thank you for asking that. Paints only last outside in our environment a certain amount of time, the way that the technology is. One other thing, I have a whole class on this, I like to go on it, but essentially is this. If you ever read a warranty from any manufacturer, they don't cover, this really not covered a lot. Chalking, fading, we talked about before, is especially when you're doing on top of a repaint job, they're mentioned in the warranty, but there's really no way to kind of understand, kind of measure these issues. Paint lifting, if you look at a warranty, if a paint lifts, but if we're doing a repaint job, I'm counting on the paint that's on the surface to adhere. And if the previous coats of paint adhere or let go, then that's really not covered under the warranty. So that's why doing that on here. With all that being said, in our environment, if you go, depending on the quality of the coating you're going at, 6 to 10 years is really the range that you're looking at for repainting work. Anything longer than that, the chalking that you're going to be getting is going to affect the next coat that you're going to put on top of it. The fading is going to happen. We have mildew. And if you leave mildew on the surface for too long, it's going to affect it. So you have to kind of get into like that little bit of a cycle when you're painting your building, in a 6 to 10 year period. If you're on the water, on the ocean, you might even have to consider, using better quality coatings and a shorter window, generally in the 6 to 8 year range, because it's such a harsh environment that it's just going to affect the way that the durability of the coatings. And since you're painting one coat on top of another, you don't want one coating to get deteriorated to the point where it cannot support another coat of paint on there. Because if you have to take off the previous coats of paint, labor costs increase extremely high, and it'll make it unfeasible to paint. Okay. All right. And again, we're kind of pushing the clock here a little bit. So I'm just going to slide by some of the other issues that you run into. Sagging, just too much paint being applied or it's too hot. Blistering is when you paint on top of too chalky of a surface itself, or you've got some water coming into the substrate itself. We talked about chalking, and what chalking is essentially the paint that's left on the surface, the pigment and the resin, the glue and the pigment, the color. The resin doesn't last forever. Once that resin starts to break down, and UV light tends to break that down a little bit, the chalking is the pigment that's left over. And so, that's kind of a normal thing with paint outside. The better, if it's applied correctly and it's applied, if it's applied at the correct thickness, you're going to get a lot better. You're going to get a lot better surface and a holdout for you. But if you paint on top of chalk, you're going to have a lot of peeling problems. So you have to be careful with it. The screen says wash surface with detergent. The best thing to do when you're cleaning outside is to make sure that you're using a pressure cleaner to clean off. What the pressure cleaner does, it knocks off a lot of the excess chalk and helps us identify if there's any kind of adhesion areas or other areas that are becoming loose. But on the outside, always use a sealer. The number one thing you're going to get from painters. You don't need a sealer for the outside, the walls. It's not chalking. You don't need to worry about it. Just because you can look at one particular area of a building and see the chalk you don't see no chalk here, doesn't mean in other areas that you're not going to see that. Using a clear sealer, and a clear sealer is going to go 4 times as much as a regular can of paint. It's going to seal that surface. It's going to allow the paint to adhere better, and it's going to allow that paint to form a thicker finish so it doesn't soak into the previous substrate, and it's going to be a lot more durable. So again, don't let any contractor tell you you don't need to seal outside. I just cannot understand. Just because the can says it doesn't need it's primer, no primer required or primer in paint, you have to seal outside. The company that started that did it as a marketing aspect, just gimmick for retail, so that people could think that their paint is better. But the company that came up with that is the biggest primer company in the United States of America. So be careful with that. Use us as your knowledge on there. Mildew, state flower of Florida, you got to clean that off. Not clean it, but you got to kill the mildew, sanitize the surface before you paint into it. Because if you paint on top of mildew, or if you're gonna have some mildew spores underneath it, it will come through the paint, and then you'll never be able to stop it unless you remove the coating itself. Cracking and flaking, some of the issues that we have. Tannic staining, if you're painting wood, you'll see that. Surfactant leaching is essentially, what happens with surfactant leaching is that all latex paints have kind of a soap to be able to let all the chemicals mix, and that doesn't evaporate because it's not a solvent. And what happens is it takes a little bit longer time to cure. And if you get that condensation on, and this generally happens with latex paints, you get that condensation that we're talking about, or the dew on the surface here, and then you don't get no rain during the day to wash that off. It brings out these surfactants, and it makes the surface look either like you got motor oil on top of it, or it might make a flat surface look like it's got rain streaks or streaks of water coming down it. So again, the only thing you can do with that is to flush it with water, or use you have to kind of let it either wear off, or let this, put a clear sealer on top of it and repaint again. So it's unfortunate. So when I'm looking at a problem, these are the questions that you ask. Paint's a chemical, doesn't have a personality. What is the issue? The product, what is the surface prep? I ask all these questions. Where is it located at? When was it painted? Know the atmospheric conditions. And I know the atmospheric conditions. You could know what the temperature and the air humidity and whether it was raining or not, and any time with using Google, and how the product was applied. Getting all those 4 pieces of information together will help me tell you what is the problem, maybe what's causing the problem, and then give you the right solution to use. So that's where I'm at with the everything there. I want to thank Dan and Ashley for helping me to be able to do the presentation. I appreciate it very much. If you have any questions regarding your CEU credits, please let me know, or Ashley, and I'm gonna put those through right away. If you have any questions, please let me know. If you need help on any painting project, let me know. If you have a painting, I like to call myself a paint forensic specialist. So if you have a problem, you don't know what's causing it, call me. I'll go out there and tell you what it is to do on the surface itself. Okay, so again, thank you. Sorry I went a little bit over, but I appreciate the time and everybody staying on the seminar.
Thanks for watching. For more great educational content, click the subscribe button now.